Why you should play Dungeons and Dragons. Many have heard of the popular tabletop role-playing game known as Dungeons and Dragons. But what if I told you that it is one of the best ways to bond with friends and family, as well as to relieve stress and work on skills relating to strategy and teamwork? Dungeons and Dragons is one of the leading fantasy tabletop role-playing games in the world, and was created in 1974 by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. Later in 1974, the game was published by Tactical Studies Rules Inc., or TSR for short. The name was created thanks to Gygax's 2-year-old daughter, who when presented with a number of options chose Dungeons and Dragons. In 1975, roughly 1,000 copies of the game were produced and sold, with sales increasing afterwards. However, in 1997, TSR was nearing bankruptcy. At this point, popular game publisher Wizards of the Coast purchased TSR, along with the rights to produce Dungeons and Dragons. In 2000, the third edition of Dungeons and Dragons was released and brought in the 20-sided dice, also known as D20 system. And in 2006, the 4th edition came out with many structure changes to simplify gaming, including new spell dynamics. In 2014, the 5th and current edition of Dungeons & Dragons was released thanks to mass positive feedback from playtesters, and popularity began to sharply increase thanks to the award-winning horror/sci-fi show Stranger Things. You may be asking yourself at this very moment a multitude of questions, such as, is it morally okay if I play it? Or even, is this propaganda created by devil worshippers? Well, I can assure you all that Dungeons & Dragons is not trying to turn you to the dark side. As a CBC radio interview, religious scholar Joseph Laycock finds a spiritual connection in Dungeons & Dragons and how it can help one find their found family. He explains how the whole moral dilemma from the 1980s to 2010s about Dungeons & Dragons was partially due to evangelical Christians, who have a notably curious relationship with the supernatural, and how early artistic depictions of creatures in the game were often misleading. There were also 2 cases of suicides that were falsely blamed on Dungeons & Dragons due to it being easily labeled as a scapegoat at the time, which sparked the medical outrage of the game. Joseph then explains that Dungeons & Dragons' very founders were actually devout Christians, with Gygax even being a Jehovah's Witness during part of his life, though the game was designed to be inclusive to many religions, with classes such as clerics and paladins being able to choose their patron god. In another article, this time conducted by Brett Knight of Forbes with Wizards of the Coast's president Cynthia Williams, the history and future of the game are reviewed. Cynthia starts as talking about her desire to play Dungeons & Dragons in the 80s, though how the predominantly male player population at the time said she couldn't play because this isn't for girls. The good news is that in 2020, Wizards of the Coast conducted a study and found that 40% of all players of Dungeons & Dragons are now female, and thanks to Stranger Things, a new generation of players are coming in, with 24% of Dungeons & Dragons players being between 20 to 24 years old, 18% being 25 to 29 years old, and another 18% being aged from 30 to 34. Being a Dungeons & Dragons player since early 2021, I don't have the most experience with the game, though I have had an immense amount of fun with the few campaigns I have been a part of in the last 2 years. One of my favorite parts of the game is the truly astounding creative potential that Dungeons & Dragons offers its players. You can choose a species, class, weapons, spells, and so many other factors of your character to reflect your own playstyle and aesthetic. I also decided to interview a more experienced player to get a broader view on player experience for Dungeons & Dragons. The player I interviewed is Ben Melton, a fellow student at the University of Kentucky, as well as the Dungeon Master for the campaign I am currently playing. He had gotten into Dungeons & Dragons via a club at his high school. He had always been a fan of fantasy movies such as Lord of the Rings and games like Skyrim. He started being a dungeon master roughly a year after he began playing Dungeons & Dragons, with his first experience being a one-shot, in other words a miniature campaign/mission for players who don't want to dive into a larger campaign that would take time to get through, during the summer of his senior year in high school. He does openly admit that being a dungeon master is not easy, as there is many factors and rules that a dungeon master must keep track of for a game to be successful, though he admitted that it also can definitely be a fun experience if an individual is up for the challenge. At the end of my interview with Ben, he made the point that everyone should at least try to play Dungeons & Dragons at least once, due to how it can be an experience that helps activate one's imagination and opens the individual to new social opportunities. Dungeons & Dragons is a game that is sharply rising in popularity across the world, and is one of the best ways to bring a diverse group of individuals together and have fun as a team. So, will you enter this world of fantasy?